Today we are presenting our fingerprint experiment. On the present slide shows the names of the team members. A brief overview of the experiment. The purpose of this experiment is to identify the fingerprint patterns of a specific fingerprint. An easy fingerprint dusting technique is used, as well as a fingerprint pattern chart to identify each fingerprint pattern. An in-depth overview of the results will be shown later in the presentation. We recommend the use of gloves and fine powder to prevent the smearing and smudging of the fingerprints. Fingerprints are known to be entirely unique to each individual person. Due to the random placement of the fingers in the womb, the cells push against one another to form ridges to create random fingerprint patterns. The context of this report is based off of personal experiences and findings during an experiment, as well as observations made during and after the experiment.
For the materials, we firstly have fingerprint type charts that we use to identify the different types of fingerprints. Then we have one sheet of black construction paper, a paintbrush, clear tape, scissors, and then finally fine powder. For example, baking powder, flour, or baby powder. Methodology. Firstly, a small piece of the clear tape was pre-wrapped. The brush was then lightly dabbed in the fine powder and dusted onto the fingertip, covering it completely. The piece of tape was placed over the powdered finger and smoothed down. The tape was then carefully removed and placed onto the black construction paper. The pattern of the fingerprint was identified by using the different fingerprint type charts. And then finally, the experiment was repeated 4 times to increase the reliability.
The result, the purpose was to identify fingerprint patterns on fingers and comparing them with each other. Every line, ridge, and curve was observed on the fingerprint patterns. In conclusion, not one of the fingers had the same fingerprint, but they did have similarities in their patterns. There was a positive outcome and every step was performed with success. Fingerprint patterns was divided into main categories, which it was arch, loop, and whirl. Categories was then divided in subcategories, which was the plain arch, tented arch, ulnar loop, radial loop, plain whirl, and double loop whirl. As you can see, the plain arch with a 42% was in the majority, and the double loop whirl with 4% was in the minority. As stated in the result, not one of the fingers looked the same, but still had similar patterns. We did come across some problems. The powder created a chaotic and messy environment. It was difficult to put the right amount of powder on the fingers, because if you put too little powder on, you couldn't see the pattern, and if you put too much powder, the pattern was smooched or smudged. Stamping of the finger on the blackboard resulted in blurring. The tape had to be handled with meticulous care, otherwise the fingerprint was not visible.
During this experiment, different fingerprints and their patterns have successfully been captured and identified. Not one of the fingerprints of the individual looked the same, but there were similarities in their patterns. As previously mentioned, the most common pattern is the plain arch, and the rarest pattern is the radial loop. Therefore, it can be concluded that people's fingerprints are unique. A few recommendations was made for this experiment to improve the results. Firstly, you need to use gloves to prevent the fingerprints from smudging, or to prevent the conductor's fingerprints from contaminating the individual's fingerprints. Use fine powder such as baking powder or baby powder to get a detailed print. And then put just enough powder on the fingertips to get a clear stamp. Not too much and not too less.